Yeah, Ralph Ellis. Who am I? Author of 12 books on biblical and historical subjects, Old Testament, New Testament. My goal in life, because I've been a lifelong atheist ever since the age of 7, I suppose, something of that nature. I was never satisfied with the stories we'd been given. There was simply not enough historicity within them. So I began looking for the real history that underlies or should underlie the gospel and the biblical stories. And I think I've found a lot of it, because otherwise you've only got a couple of options. Either this is all mythology, as the mythicists will like to say, it's all been made up, or you accept it just verbatim because, the books are there, so just believe the books. I've sort of trod a sort of mid-path between the two, thinking that there has to be some historical context behind the books that have been written. But since we can't easily find these characters in the historical record, I went looking for them. And I do think I've found pretty much all of the characters within the biblical record in the historical record. And they're more or less exactly the same as the biblical texts say. The only difference is most of them are rather more important than the biblical texts make out. So they are real kings and real leaders of real peoples. So they are pharaohs of Egypt. They are kings of, Syria and Judea, like the king of Edessa. And there is a lot of information to back that up. Not going to get into any detail, but just for one little illustration, Josephus Flavius says that the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. Now there is a positive link back into real history, and that's the sort of real history I've been exploring.
Thanks, Ralph. So the chronology of the Gospels and the historicity of Jesus.
Yes. If I make my side clear, then that might explain to vocab the differences between us, because I've no doubt the vocab is taking the classical chronology of the New Testament. So my new chronology of the New Testament is based on data that you can pick up within the gospel story. And the main point being that the gospel story actually happened within the AD 50s. Well, no, actually the AD 60s instead of the AD 20s. So there's a 40-year chronological chasm, as I say. So my chronology is different to the classical. And there is good reason for thinking that. For instance, we have the murders of Zacharias, Barachias, or Baruch, which Jesus mentions as being a very specific murder between the altar and the temple. And he laments the murder of this guy. Well, that is a fairly well-known murder. That was the murder of Zacharias Baruch in AD 60s. He was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. And so we have a link there to a later date. We have Jesus describing Jerusalem surrounded by a trench and a wall. That comes straight out of Josephus. It's a description of the siege of Jerusalem. And if Jesus is mentioning that, well, they say it's prophecy, of course, but if he's mentioning that, it's likely to be a later story, AD 60s story. Jesus he mocks Ben-Zizit Hakesef in exactly the same manner as the Talmud does, which is okay. He talks about his tassels and his cushions and all of this sort of business in the same manner that the Talmud does. But again, Ben-Zizit Hakesef is an AD 60s character. He is one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. And there are many more of these. Jesus became high priest of Jerusalem, Hebrews 7. That is easily linked up with Jesus of Gamala, who is an AD 60s character. We have the research of Professor Robert Eisenman, who linked Mary Boethus with Mary Magdalene, which I concur with. I think that's a very good link. The trouble is that Mary Boethus married Jesus of Gamala, who became the high priest in AD 63, I think it was. So again, we're linking up the gospel story with the AD 60s. So I don't know if you want me to go on, but you've got an idea here that we might be talking about an AD 60s story rather than an AD 20s story. And the ultimate reason for this different chronology is that the Jesus character is linked to the Jewish revolt. So we all know that Jesus was some sort of revolutionary. He was jailed alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what revolution was that? And the answer in my books, of course, is that was the Jewish revolt of AD 66 to AD 70. So we're talking about a much later date, and that Jesus was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. And that's why his story is so much more important than if he was a mere carpenter back in the 1830s. So I think that sort of sets the scene.
Okay, yeah. So the Gospels do, fortunately, give us some good places to sink our teeth in as far as dates go. And when we add not only the Gospel data, Synoptics plus John, we also, of course, have Acts, sequel to Luke. And then we have the Epistles, primarily Paul, but not just Paul, of course, James and Jude and a number of others. And even to a certain extent, the Apocalypse, the Revelation, has some dating elements in it as well. So when we take those markers plus what we know about Second Temple Judaism, plus some interesting archaeological elements, plus the development of Christianity as we look at early church history, we look at that, we have a story that fits pretty snugly, pretty tightly within a small window, a small frame. There's not a lot of leeway. There's not a lot of room to play with there. There's things here and there that could be adjusted or tweaked, or we might have questions about and things like that. Sometimes it comes from gaps in our, what we may call secular or extra biblical history. But the kind of slides that Mr. Ellis is talking about seem really beyond the pale of what is possible. And what we have going on is if we want to take certain elements serious and say, well, this writer mentioned this person and that lines up with Josephus here, we really got to develop a stern methodology when we know to take a character, say, in the gospel seriously, but not the date, and when we need to take the date seriously. So I'm hoping by the end of the conversation, I'll have an understanding, the audience will have an understanding of how it is Mr. Ellis determines which times we take what data seriously. Because, Jesus's birth slot, you could say birth year, but the time Jesus is born, the things that happen there, along with the crucifixion, along with things that are mentioned in Acts, but even when they look back on certain dates, when you have certain rulers that only ruled at certain times, and all that going on together. Well, here we go in this window. We're sliding it over here on Mr. Ellis's schema. Why do we take certain things as that's correct? So the character of Jesus, he seems to say, okay, the character, he is this and that, but he's also this and that, which of course, like he said, is more important than the Gospels let on. Same thing with Paul, from what I've heard Mr. Ellis say, unless I'm mistaken. I heard it, and it's hard to sometimes grasp it. That's what he really is saying, that Paul is actually Josephus, things like that. Okay, why do we take some of the data serious, but not the other data? So I'm just hoping we can come to a not just a stern, but a robust and consistent methodology, because I think that'll really help understand how he gets the conclusions that he gets. That'll help me understand, okay, based upon what methodology, because we all know when we do history, there's historiography, and so there's an art and a science to that, and there's practices that have been developed not just for the sake of tradition or something like that, but to ensure professionalism and prevent sloppy errors by anybody. I'm not saying the person I'm talking to. I'm just saying for all of us as we evolve to try to uncover the past and understand what's really there. And so that's what I hope I can understand, because the Gospels give us a lot of dates and a lot of places to hang our hats on. And if we start to mess around with one, it's not like we can just take it like a mobile home on a trailer and just remove it to another place. It's a whole thing of dominoes where it creates all kinds of other problems. I want to understand, okay, how do we get that, not others? For example, Jesus is referred to in Timothy as giving a good confession before Pontius Pilate. That's Paul writing to Timothy in Ephesus. So then you also have the 4 Gospels. So that's at least four separate sources saying he's crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate during the time of Tiberius Caesar, when you add that up as well. That's just one element. And so we have multiple sources pointing to this singular event. Well, if we're going to slide that all the way over here, we have to have awfully good reason to be able to do that. And it has to be based upon a consistent methodology. So that'd be one of the key things I would say is, the crucifixion of Jesus is sort of a benchmark that there's a lot of agreement on. And forget about, a year or two or a day or two. If we're going to slide it over decades, we need to have awful good reasons and be able to pick up all the pieces that come from the fallout of doing something like that.
Agreed. Yeah, shall I just jump in there again there, Esoteric? Yeah, okay, I got the thumbs up. Yep. Yes, good points. I fully agree. We need to have good reason for redating the gospel story. And I think there are some good reasons. I mean, the primary good reason is that all of these people are missing from the historical record. So we're working from a big lacuna to start with. We don't know who Saul is. He doesn't appear in the historical record. We don't know who Jesus is. He doesn't appear in the historical record. And so we have to start looking for these characters. And you've only got a couple of options. Either they're mythical, or perhaps we're looking in the wrong era or the wrong location for them if we want to find them in the historical record. So yes, you have these dates which Christianity has made canonical because they are accepted. But there are no real, apart from the appearance of Pontius Pilate, there are no good dates within the New Testament narrative. So what do we have? We have the birth in AD 6, that's probably correct, but that wouldn't alter the story because it would just mean he was much older when he was crucified. The crucifixion, yes, we have the gospel story that this happened under Pontius Pilate. But of course, we have the story from Josephus that the 3 leaders of the Jewish revolt were crucified in AD 70 outside the walls of Jerusalem. They were taken down early by Josephus himself, and 2 of them died and 1 of them survived. It is a perfect parallel for the Passion story, the crucifixion of Jesus. And of course, the person who took them down from the cross was Josephus Flavius. And the father of Josephus was called Matthias. And so a lot of people, including myself, understand that Joseph Arimathea could well be Josephus Flavius because his father was called Matthias. So he was Josephus ben Matthias. They have very, very similar appellations. And so we have a crucifixion story, but this is not the traditional AD 30s story. This is the AD 70s, in AD 70 exact. So we have a parallel story. So how does that affect the rest of the gospel story? Well, you mentioned the epistles, of course. And And there is a problem with the epistles. The epistles don't have the full crucifixion narrative. Now, Saul, when he was on his tours around the Mediterranean, he would have been lamenting, this tragic crucifixion of Jesus, and the full crucifixion story. But he doesn't. We don't get the full story within the epistles. All we get is a couple of mentions here and there of crucifixion, which are tacked on to the end of verses. But that's not what he would have been doing. He would have been lamenting this tragic event and giving all of the details of the crucifixion event. As everybody knows, all the way from the trial all the way through to the crucifixion, and the women around the cross, and the sponge and the spear, everything that is to do with that crucifixion story, he would have been mentioning. But he doesn't. The epistles they simply miss out that story. And the reason, in my view, that they miss out this story is because it hadn't happened yet. It happened in AD 70, and we have that story from Josephus Flavius. And therefore, what they're talking about, if they're talking about any resurrection, which there are a couple of mentions of resurrection, of course, they're just talking about a death and rebirth cult, exactly the same as Masonry is today. So I have died and I have been reborn in exactly the same fashion. And of course, Lazarus did exactly the same. Lazarus died and was reborn in exactly the same fashion. And so you could talk about the resurrection of Lazarus in exactly the same manner as the epistles talk about the resurrection of Jesus, in exactly the same fashion. So the chronology does work. We have a birth of Jesus. I put it either AD 6, which is the traditional date, of course, for the birth of Jesus, perhaps AD 14, because of the royal family I link him to. The epistles, well, that's, the work of Saul, of course, going across the Mediterranean. That would be the AD 50s. That is classical chronology all the same. And then the events of Jesus's mission and his crucifixion would have been between AD 66 and AD 70, and the events of the Jewish revolt. And of course, the people who were involved in the Jewish revolt, if we look at the historical side of this, the people involved were Jesus of Gamala, Jesus Cephius, as narrated by Josephus Flavius. And these are obvious parallels to the biblical story, to the gospel story, that he's actually talking about Jesus of Gamala, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. Remember, it was Jesus of Gamala who we think married Mary Boethus, who is Mary Magdalene, as per the Talmud. So again, we get all of these links pointing towards the AD 60s. So the chronology does work. I mean, it's a different chronology, but it does work.
Yeah, so Josephus says that he knew these crucifixion victims.
Yes.
So you believe that then Jesus knew not only Josephus, but that also that means that Jesus would have known the Apostle Paul?
Yes, yeah, because he was Josephus Flavius. As you know, I link Saul and Josephus Flavius.
Okay, so,
and so, yes, he would have known him. But remember, their main meeting was in the AD 60s, which was after the epistles had already been written. So the epistles were written in the AD 50s.
If Josephus, a.k.a. Paul, was responsible for getting Jesus off the cross, why would Paul proclaim the resurrection, which would indicate that Jesus died and rose again, as he wrote about in 1 Corinthians 15? If he's the one who got him off the cross, then why would he be a proclaimer of the resurrection?
because the first resurrection was a symbolic resurrection, the same as Lazarus was. So Lazarus was resurrected before Jesus, and that was in exactly the same symbolic resurrection, exactly as the same as I've been resurrected. I had a resurrection many years ago.
Were you on a cross, though, Mr. Ellis?
Not on a cross, but I was resurrected as a third-degree Freemason.
I know, but I mean, crucifixion is something we know about. You know, there's archaeological sources. For example, you probably know the guy who, you know, had the spike driven through his foot, and they couldn't get it out, and so, you know, they had to take part of his foot with the spike, and then the wood is still there. You know, we've got this, right? That's not symbolic. That crap hurts, right?
No,
and so that's
both.
why. But I mean, that's why Josephus would ask the general to come down to get these guys off the cross, because they were his buddies, right? So that wasn't symbolic. You know, Josephus is writing a history. Yeah, I know, but I'm saying, you said you had a resurrection, but you're talking about something symbolic and Lazarus and all that. I'm saying they go off the cross. These other two men die that are pulled off a cross, so they're actually dead. But why would Paul then say, I preach Christ and him crucified? And why would he write a whole chapter on the resurrection? And why would he say that if there's no resurrection, we're to be pitied? And why would Paul say that my priority is not even to baptize in 1 Corinthians 1, but it's to preach Christ? Why would Paul be someone who stands before the Athenians, the Stoic and Epicureans, who he knows have a derision for the physical body, and then proclaim the resurrection to them, which Luke records is why they derided him, but some heard him, the Bible says in Acts right there. Why would he do that at the Areopagus if he actually knows, I'm the one responsible for getting Jesus pulled off the cross so he could survive? Why would Paul then proclaim his resurrection? I'm still not understanding that.
Well, because there were two resurrections, of course. The AD 50s, he could not be, under my chronology, he could not be talking about the real crucifixion, because that hadn't happened yet. But all we get within the epistles is little tiny mentions of crucified, which don't actually make much sense. I mean, you look at Galatians 5:24, and they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with affections and lusts. Quite obviously, the word is not being used in the right fashion there. That's not a real crucifixion. They're using the word storu as being to crucify someone, to persecute someone. They that are Christ have persecuted the flesh with affections and lusts. That's not talking about a real crucifixion. And all of these mentions within the epistles are just little add-ons. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Well, that's not talking about the crucifixion, but we preach I can't even say my words now. We preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block. Well, that's not the crucifixion story. This is just mentions of crucifixion which have been misinterpreted or interpolated into the text. And there are only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
okay, but
9,
Mr. Ellis,
10.
Ellis, in Philippians 2, the way the Apostle Paul writes about Jesus is this: he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So what you did there is you took some of the passages where Paul makes Christians through our through our union in Christ, in a sense, symbolically die with him, but it's based upon his real death. So what do you do here with this passage? And this isn't the only one. We could go to others. You were able to mention a couple. I could mention quite a few as well, where it says he was obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Does that sound figurative to you? Because he says death on a cross there.
Yes, but all of those are tacked on to the end of verses, aren't they?
No, they're not. They're not. So in Greek, there's no periods, of course. There's no punctuation. And so to say something's tacked on doesn't make sense unless it's totally, has nothing to do with the context. And the context of Philippians 2, it's called the Carmen Christi, is that Paul is telling these Philippians, you need to have one mind in Christ. And then he says Christ was humbled. And then he goes on to explain the humility of Christ. So he uses the death of Christ as an object lesson for how the Philippians should treat each other. It's based upon Christ's real death. So that's not this is in the centerpiece of his argument here in the Carmen Christi. So this is not something that's tacked on. If you're going to say it's tacked on, Mr. Ellis, you would need to, do something like present some textual data to say, look, in our earliest copy of Philippians, this verse is absent. All the mentions of the cross are absent, but actually the opposite is true. If you've ever been able to look at the work of Larry Hurtado, he showed when he was alive, he was at Edinburgh, he showed how the early Christian scribes, whenever they wrote the name of Christ in Greek, they abbreviated it with something called a starogram, which is they made the shape of the cross in the Greek letters by abbreviating his name. It's quite a fascinating thing. I encourage the audience to look it up. In English, it's Staurogram, I believe, and Larry Hurtado. He's not the only one, but he's done the most in-depth work on this. And so this is something the early Christians understood, even the copyists themselves. And so it's not tacked on. The textual data is the opposite, is that it has quite a long train of succession about a literal death of Jesus. And here in Philippians 2, it says even death on a cross. So what makes you claim that that's tacked on to Philippians 2 when it's literally the centerpiece of his argument?
Well, it's not, because it says, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death. Okay, symbolic death, the same death as I've had.
Where's it symbolic, though? Where are you getting symbolic from?
Because there is no crucifixion story here. Saul was running around the Mediterranean trying to get new adherents to his new church, and also getting money to them. From them, as he says on many occasions.
Okay.
And he would have been explaining the full crucifixion story, the trial, the scourging, carrying the cross, being put on the cross, the people around the cross, all of those details, which you know very well, he never mentions within the epistles.
Well, hold on. There's a lot there you're saying, but it's just sliding by, but it should be challenged. I mean, honestly speaking, Paul does mention some Paul does. That's what I'm going to do. That's why I wanted to make sure we could stop there. Paul does mention some of those details. Number one, I've already brought up in the beginning. He specifically mentions the historical figure of Pontius Pilate, and even you understand Pontius Pilate is a real historical figure rooted in a certain time. For he says to Timothy that he gave the good confession, for example. Then I show you in Philippians, you have death and his cross right there. That's not the only thing. I'm going to show you some others.
End of the verse. It's the end of that little section.
Notice when I began my basic chronology, I said, so the gospel data, and I mentioned Acts, I mentioned the Apocalypse, Revelation. So notice I'm also mentioning the genres of literature. I said the epistles, primarily by Paul. I know you read, the difference in genres. So Paul's writing epistles. These are occasional letters, and that the point is not to do what the gospelers did. The point is to build upon what they did. And so that's not his intention, is to retell the whole gospel story. But nonetheless, I've pointed out several times where he does retell the important points. We know, for example, Paul had access to Luke because he quotes the Gospel of Luke and Timothy and refers to it as scripture along with a portion of Torah. And so he puts them together. He literally quotes Jesus in regards to muzzle not the ox. Now here we go to something that I just don't see how you can make symbolic. This is in Colossians 1:20. We've already got death on the cross. Now we have Jesus making peace by the blood of the cross. So in Colossians 1:20, if it's symbolic, Mr. Ellis, why does it say the blood of the cross? We've already got death on the cross. Now we've got blood of his cross. The verse is Colossians 1:20. Why does he say blood of the cross if it's merely symbolic? And that's not tacked on again. You have no evidence that it would be tacked on. You'd have to demonstrate that, not just tell us. But he says making peace by the blood of his cross. Then in Colossians 2, he says this he set aside. This is verse 14, nailing it to the cross. So right there in his letter to the church of Colossae, he says blood of the cross. Then a chapter later, and I know the chapters are later, but I'm just giving reference here. In 2:14, he says, nailing it to the cross. So, Mr. Ellis, how do you have the Apostle Paul writing about blood on the cross, nailing it to the cross in the beginning of his letter to the church of Colossae? How can you say that's symbolic? What do you do with blood on the cross and nailing it to the cross? That sounds very physical, doesn't it?
It's still not the crucifixion story. The crucifixion story is missing from all of the epistles. You've just found the word storos. That's all you found.
No, I found the word blood and death, Mr. Ellis. Please don't minimize what I found for you. I also found blood and death. How do you deal with blood? Why did Jesus have blood on the cross, Mr. Ellis?
Well, who's saying that it means cross? That's been interpreted as cross, but it's just stauros. It can mean to establish, to stand.
Why is there blood then on the stauros?
Well, I'm sure that many people write about blood. I mean, that proves nothing.
Okay, why was he nailed to the stauros in Colossians 2?
In Colossians 2.
Colossians 2:14, it says nailing it to the cross.
Which is the end of the verse again. Nailed to cross is the end of the verse.
Mr. Ellis, you're under the impression that the period in English indicates the end of the verse. It does not. It's not the end of the verse.
Well,
it's the end of the English sentence, sure.
Yeah, I'm reading in the Greek as well.
But do you see a period in the Greek, Mr. Ellis?
No, I see verses, and
the verses are inserted later by an Englishman. They're helpful reference markers, but you know very well Paul didn't put 1:14, 2:14. So I'm asking you about, you can't just evade everything by saying it's tacked on.
It was written in sentences.
Let's not talk about tacked on. Let's talk about nailed on. Why is this person being nailed to the cross, Mr. Ellis, if it's symbolic?
It's the, as I say, it's the end of the verse again. You cannot write. Nobody in that era, even in the Greek, wrote a slab of text without any punctuation, without any separation into sentences.
Well, yes, they did. Well, hold on, Mr. Ellis. We might be displaying a lack of information here. The earliest manuscripts, you should know, are all in capital Greek letters with no spaces.
Mm-hmm.
You just told us no one did that. It's the opposite. They were crunched together to save space in the earliest manuscripts. All of our earliest manuscripts, when it comes to the Greek, are all capitals, and there are no spaces. And Bart Ehrman, even, for example, he showed this where you can sometimes have trouble in translating, because he gives an English example: God is now here or God is nowhere. You have to know where to divide it because there are not even spaces. So you're saying something that goes against the textual data. But leaving that aside, why do you need to be nailed if the cross is not real? I'm going to bring up the Greek right now. I'm going to show everybody what you're saying is not accurate.
You're misinterpreting here, because you look at the next verse and it starts as a beginning of a sentence, and it will start like that within the Greek as well. Not even in the Greek would someone actually read the text, even when it was written like that. They wouldn't read it as a block of text. They would have breathing spaces, which we call sentences. And the next sentence is obviously a breathing space. It's quite obvious.
The breathing, though, there actually are breathing marks, but they're notated in Greek, and it's not obvious that no, it's not. For example, like you have in the ha, you have that going on. That's a definite article, ha.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is not accurate. This is not how Greek readers interpret it. This is not how they understood it. So you can't avoid it. So here's what's happening. It seems you're admitting nailing to the cross is an actual real physical thing, because you don't need to get nailed if it's not a cross. But to avoid a disruption to your theory, you're telling us it's tacked on. Do you have any textual data to show us Colossians 2, verse 14 is missing in some early New Testament manuscripts? If you do, then we can have an interesting conversation about that. But I have Metzer's textual commentary in front of me. I have Comfort's textual commentary. And I have his list of early papyri, all that right here. But I don't see any evidence that we have some kind of major variant in 2:14 where nailing is left out. So you can't just assert that it's included later. Why would you do that?
Well, because you're operating on an English translation and not the Greek. And
can I show the audience the Greek, please? I have it.
Yes.
Am I allowed to share my screen? I would like to show that I'm not operating in the way that you indicated. Okay. Is everyone... I'm not sure. I'm trying to see what you were seeing here. What are you guys able to see?
We can see the screen.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, let me make sure it's the right... It's not showing what I need to show here. It's showing... Can you see? Hold on. Let me... I want to show you here this. Well, actually, can I just grab my Greek New Testament? Let me just grab my Greek New. I'll just show you physically. Hold on. Because I wasn't able to share my screen. I have it up in Logos, but So you're saying that I'll see what you're saying, right? If I look at it in Greek, but what about the Greek will change? What will change the conclusion here? How will the Greek show me that nailed is not actually there or something like that? How will that work? Hello,
But
can you guys hear me?
The next verse is obviously a breathing space. I mean, that's pretty obvious from the way you
He
read it.
disarmed the rulers and authorities.
Sorry?
It says he disarmed the rulers and authorities.
Sorry, which verse are you talking about now?
Colossians 2:14.
Yeah, I've got that.
Okay, but you understand there's if you're going to use this idea of there's breathing spaces, which is not really the way they add the periods in the Greek. It's based upon the understanding of where a thought concludes or begins.
Well,
but if you're going to add that,
verse 14 obviously ends at the end of that verse because the next verse is talking about something else. Therefore, there is a breathing space, whether it's marked in the text or not.
Wait, what? But how does that mean that? How does that mean it wasn't there originally?
Nailing to the cross is not linked to spoiled principalities and powers, as it's translated into the English. That's clearly a new topic. And so, therefore, it will be read as a new topic. And so the previous verse is the end of the previous topic. That's the only way you can read it. But what you still haven't done is you still haven't shown us a complete crucifixion story within the epistles. Why is that missing from the epistles? It's missing because it hadn't happened yet. So all you have within the epistles is a couple of mentions of resurrection because Jesus has had a symbolic resurrection, the same as Lazarus. And you see a few mentions of a cross, some of which are mistranslated. Quite obviously so, that they shouldn't be translated as cross. And the others have just been tacked on, but there is no crucifixion story. Surely you must see that.
No. Okay, so there it is in Greek. It should be showing now. It's showing now?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you guys see the blue highlighted sentence there?
Yes.
So that's Colossians 2:14.
Mm-hmm.
Can you still see it? I'm moving it up and I'm trying to make it bigger. I can't see exactly what you're seeing, the way it operates.
Yeah. No,
okay.
No, we can see that.
Okay. Okay. Good. Do you see that? That's star on there.
Yep.
Right there.
Story.
Yeah. So we got that.
Yep. Buildings and structures.
Okay. So
click on it again so everyone can see the translations.
Yeah, right there.
Buildings and structures, cultural ontology, a cross was a means of execution. Okay, so that's their translation.
A
that's
criminal would be staked to a cross by the hands and feet and hung up to die by asphyxiation. Okay, right? So you saw that?
Yeah.
Okay. And where I'm trying to find what you're saying is the key here that's going to help me understand.
Because the verse 15 is not linked to verse 14. It's talking about a different subject. So it doesn't matter whether there's a full stop there or not. They're talking about a different subject in verse 15. Therefore, it is a different verse.
Okay. Right before it, it says, you who were dead in your trespasses and uncircumcised flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses. By canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, this he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. So notice the triumph.
Nailing it to the cross. Yes, not really talking about yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's here. That's why I wanted to bring us here. But notice the victory is tied in directly with Jesus by triumphing over them in him.
It's not really talking about the crucifixion of Jesus, though, is it? It's saying blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross.
Oh, so so is it tacked on, or is it that I misunderstood the verse? Which one is it?
Whichever you like, but it's not the crucifixion story.
See, so I knew it was here.
Show
Remember
me the
what
spear.
I said? Paul ties in our cancellation of our debt.
No,
this is gospel, so you know this.
Mm-hmm.
Ties in our cancellation of our debt with the very real death of Jesus Christ. That's how our debt is canceled. And so here there is Jesus that is actually dying, as we've already showed from Colossians 1. And don't forget, right up here, it says, right before that, it says, God who raised him from the dead, verse 12. It says the powerful working God who raised him from the dead. So when you take it all together, you have this obvious tie-in with the Christians with what happened on the cross. No, the symbolic element is that our trespasses are nailed as well, but it's based upon Jesus being nailed. And that's why the nailing is important. The metaphor of the cross is directly related. So this is talking about the crucifixion of Jesus, but it's tied in practically with what the Christians have as well. And that's why the end of the sentence says, by triumphing over them in him. So it is talking about Christ. So see the in him right here in blue. Do you see in blue right there that I've got it highlighted right here where the cursor is?
Mm-hmm.
Altus in atau. My pronunciation is not always perfect, but I know where I'm at in the text. So there you have them triumphing over them in him, and it's based upon what he did.
Is the translation I have in it, not him.
Wait, by triumphing over. Hold on, are you in 2:15?
No, I'm on the King James version, and the King James translates that as it, not him.
Let's see. Let's go to Colossians 2:15, the KJV. See if that's right. And what do you believe that would indicate if that's the case?
Well, I don't want to get tied up too much in this because we're obviously at loggerheads. You can't show me the crucifixion story in the Epistles, and I can't explain every single verse that's there in the Epistles. But here's a question for you, just to go off.
Well, Mr. Ellis, I just want to show what you did, though. Well, first you just assumed it was tacked on.
Hold on, vocab. Hold on.
When you looked into it, you said, "Oh, I'm misinterpreting it." You know, that's not really fair. But okay,
let Ralph ask the question.
Just on a slight tangent, looking at Lazarus, would you say that that is symbolic or a real resurrection?
Neither. Recitation. Because Lazarus did not go on to live forever, but he physically was risen again. But the technical term there would be recitation, because he does die again. But it's very physical, and this is, remember in the beginning of this, I said, Mr. Ellis, I hope that you can share with the audience your methodology of how what you decide to take as a historical element or not. Because I remember you said once that you have 90% of the Bible actually happening. You just shifted the timeline. And the reason I bring that up is because here in the KJV, you might even remember this, says, hey, no, don't be going in there. Behold, he stinketh. It's been 3 days. So if it's symbolic, why would he smell? Unless it's because of rigor mortis.
Well, if you had been locked into
or decomposing, I'm sorry.
If you had been locked into a tomb for 3 days without a latrine, I think you would smell as well.
So Lazarus was actually locked in there, so that's not symbolic then anymore, is it?
Well, it's not, because, well, it's the symbolic death because you don't die. But as a Mason, you are actually lowered into a tomb and you are assumed to be dead. But obviously that's symbolic because you're not really dead. So you go through this symbolic death and symbolic resurrection, the same as they used to do within Greece and Egypt and many other places. So, yeah, he would be locked into a tomb. It was a much more difficult exercise than we would go through within Masonry, because it would appear that they were actually stuck in a tomb for 3 days, which would be quite a trial for you, locked into the darkness in a tomb that you cannot get out of,
right,
without the assistance of your fellows outside. So you've got to be able to trust your people outside.
Do you have John 11:37 in front of you? Are you able to look at that? Is that up? One? John 11:37. It's the place with Lazarus. John 11:37.
Look up Lazarus.
So I just want to make sure it's John chapter 11 verse 37. Verse 37. So notice that he was sick first in the account, but then you have two places there where you have Mary say something that I think is very significant. Do you see verse 32?
Yeah.
Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Yes.
And then
Symbolic
in
death.
John 11:37, it says, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?
Yes.
And then also verse 34 says, where have you laid him? So right there you have multiple indications that he's dead and laid in a tomb. And the Greek word is there, we do have for tomb, used multiple times. So
Yes.
he's laid in it, though, because he was dead, but they wish Jesus could have prevented him from dying. So where are you getting the symbolism there?
Well, I was dead as well. So do you regard my death as a real death or
Did you
a symbolic
stink?
death? Sorry?
Did you stink
Would have done
because
if
of
I'd been
decomposure
in
to
a
your
tomb.
body?
If I'd been in a tomb for 3 days without a latrine, I'm sure I would have stunk, yes.
Without a latrine, I'm not sure where you're getting that. You're reading a detail into the text that I'm not aware of.
Well,
Does it
a
say that in
tomb,
here?
if you've ever been to Jerusalem, you'll know that the tombs don't have latrines in them. Therefore,
Yes,
you'll be,
I understand. My
be
point is, though,
shitting in your own tomb.
there's stuff that's you're assuming he's alive, though. That's what's under question.
Well,
Why would you assume he's alive when the crowd says he could have prevented him from dying? And what they're also weeping. And then you have her say, if you would have came, my brother would not have died. Where's the indication he's locked in there and alive?
Tombs had rolling stones. You know, all of the tombs that are
Yes, I
visible
know.
now.
Yes, that actually is archaeological confirmation that the New
Absolutely.
Testament writers knew what they were talking about. But
Yeah, all of
here,
the tombs were like that. Yes.
here, what I'm saying is, yes, in Jerusalem at that time specifically, but here's what I'm saying. It says my brother would not have died. Remember, he was sick prior to this. Why is upon your theory, why is he locked in there? He's sick and now he's locked in there? Why? Who locked him in there?
Because it's part of the symbolic initiation into a Masonic type sect. You will go through this initiation, and this initiation involves
Wouldn't that be a good
you
thing?
being locked into a tomb, the same
Wouldn't
as
it
I
be-
was locked into a tomb.
It wouldn't be a good thing to get into the Masonic sect and do the initiation? Why is everybody crying and upset at Jesus then?
Because these were secret societies. Not everybody would have known what the significance of this was.
So no one was in on the joke except for Lazarus and Jesus.
Oh, I'm sure the rest of the... Well, even from the disciples, even the disciples didn't know what was going on. What did Jesus say about the disciples? Why do you not understand? Why do you hear and not understand? What did he say? What's that quote? I'm sure you can get that quote for me.
Okay, so I want to focus again at the end of this because every indication is that a man died and was risen again. John 11:44, the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips. This is all very physical, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go.
Which is exactly how you come out of the tomb in a Masonic third degree. You are hoodwinked. You have a cloth over your face.
So if nobody is aware of the joke, why does verse 46 and verse 45 say, or the ritual initiation rather, why does it say that many people believed on him after this event and then they wanted to kill Lazarus? Why does it say they believed on him if they didn't even understand it was a Masonic ritual?
Well, because they probably thought it was real, that he'd actually come back to life. So they thought it was miraculous.
So the audience thought it was real. The sisters thought it was real. But Ralph Ellis, Jesus, and Lazarus are the only people who are aware that it was not actually real. Is anyone else aware of this?
Well, we know that this was true, but that's why Jesus was talking in parables all the time, because he was talking on two levels. That's why he says things like, John 8:43, why do you not understand my speech, even because you cannot even hear my word? It's quite obvious that even his disciples did not understand what was going on half the time, which is why he berated them on a number of occasions for this. So yes, there were secrets that were being held from the rest of the congregation because this was an initiatory church. You had to go through levels of initiation.
Well, I thank you for giving your perspective and all that. You have to understand, Ralph, for anyone else to share it, they would have to have publicly available information that could indicate to it when you indicate that that's the fact, when you're telling us that even the people who were there then didn't know what you know now. So this is difficult to understand. And I would bring our attention, so we don't just belabor there, to later on in this same passage of John 11, verse 49 says, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. And then he goes on and gives a speech. Since we can't agree on Lazarus, I'm curious if we could agree on Caiaphas. And the reason why I bring up Caiaphas, because you said, well, Pilate's the only guy that we can really anchor in. But we have the Caiaphas ossuary discovered in 1990, burial bone box of this priestly family. And here's the thing, the date of origin is 42 to 43. This is the same Caiaphas who would later preside over the trial of Jesus. Mr. Ellis, how can Caiaphas die in 43? Be alive during the ministry of Jesus at this time, and yet Jesus himself is crucified all the way in 70. Yet Caiaphas, who was alive during his ministry and presided over his trial, how can Caiaphas be dead at 42, 43? And we have archaeological evidence to that claim when you're saying it was way over here in 70. But what about Caiaphas?
Yeah.
The text tells us he was there, and the bone box tells us he was there. But you're saying, no, he's over there. Do you believe that Caiaphas lived in 70 as well?
No, when they rewrote this story back into the AD 30s, AD 20s, AD 30s, they would have to change certain elements of it to fit in with that chronology. So it's pretty obvious that they did. Therefore, they chose Pontius Pilate because he was an AD 30s character. And probably Caiaphas as well. He was 18 to 36, according to the reference I've got. So it wasn't in the 40s.
No. Hold on. The bone box, but the way my understanding of the way it works is not related to his death, but related to his reburial. Because at this time, they would bury them at first. So what you said as far as his death date, I'm not necessarily disputing that. But then they go in once there's basically only bones left, and then put what's left in that's why the ossuaries are sometimes nicknamed as bone boxes.
Yes.
So just some clarification to that, because maybe I gave the impression about his death date. If so, I apologize. But the bone box would originate or a 42, 43 as far as the bone box itself. That's when we would date that and understand that. But just to clarify. So I know what you're saying there.
Yeah,
but see, you're assuming your theory there, Mr. Ellis. You're assuming it's rewritten when I'm showing you a very real historical figure who's in the text multiple times, and we have hard archaeological data for. You're saying these people all the way over here knew who Caiaphas was, had the dates right, and then put him in the 30s. But you don't have any reasons why we should believe that's what happened when they're telling you.
We have lots of reasons. I mean, so you have these two characters, which are AD 30s characters, which they would have to change within the story to make it an AD 30s story. But we have a lot of information that is contradictory to that. Things like Saul putting the proto-Christians, the Nazarene, into jail. So Saul is going around Judea and sort of Syria as well, and he's persecuting the Church of Jesus and James and putting these people in prison and persecuting them unto death. Under what authority did Saul do that? Saul was a tent maker, yeah? So how was a tent maker putting these people in prison?
Okay, a few things. I feel like every time I've brought us to a place where we need to ask why we're not accepting the historical rootedness of it. We've got blood and nails and death and crosses, and now we've got bone boxes with Caiaphas. Every time we've got dead men who are wrapped up and stinking. Every time we go to that, you have some explanation, which is really more of an evasion. It sounds like to protect your theory, but I understand in the past you've changed your mind on things, and so I'm hoping maybe that'll happen again at some point with some of this. But now we're going to a new topic. Okay, I'll go there. We know that Paul did this under the authority of those who had authority in Jerusalem, and I've heard your theory that the tent maker, which is later on for Paul, during this time of life, it's not an indication that he needed to work as a tent maker during this time in his life. Later on, that was a skill or trade that is associated with him. I heard you say that it's actually a coded way to describe Paul as a mason. So that means you have Paul as a Mason, but Paul is really Josephus. So Josephus is also a Mason, and Jesus is a Mason, and they're in this. So Jesus is a carpenter. Is that also secretly letting you know who he's a Mason? And do you know about Lazarus' occupation? Is that also telling you that he's secretly a Mason as well? And where in Josephus' writings do you see evidence that he was a Mason? Because if he's Paul, the tent maker, then he's a Mason too. But isn't he described as a general? I'm very confused about a lot of this. And maybe you can help me here.
I don't say that Saul was a Mason.
I heard you say that. I heard you say that. I heard you say, I did hear you say this.
No, the Mason bit comes from Jesus, who was called a tekton. He wasn't a carpenter. He was called a tekton, which is an architect, which is in the Greek, it's a name for a Mason. So Jesus was the Mason, not Saul. Saul was a tent maker. So the first question, I've got two questions. With
Daniel Utterbrink. With Daniel Utterbrink, that's where you were talking about Paul, the tent maker. You were saying he's actually this powerful guy, and so he's not really just a tent maker.
Well, okay, if you want to go there,
and the indication was he's secretly a Mason. You did say that with Daniel. I just listened to the debate.
No. I think you misunderstood. He was an important character, and that part of it comes from Acts 11:28, which I'm sure you can call up there, which says that, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, signified by the Spirit that there would be a great famine throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And the question
Suetonius mentions him. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the question then is, who was Agabus? And the considered opinion of, again, myself and Professor Robert Eisenman is that Agabus is King Agbarus of Edessa, because the queen of Edessa was Queen Helena, and it was Queen Helena in history who was known for giving the famine relief to Judea.
Right, and but how does Acts 21:10 describe Agabus, though, Mr. Ellis?
Sorry, well, we're looking at 11:28 first.
Well, I know, but he's mentioned in other parts of Acts. You don't want to isolate it and say he's a king.
Agabus,
he's a prophet named who came from Judea.
Well, yes, because he was essentially at that point he was becoming the king of Judea. But there we go.
But it says a prophet who came down from Judea. He's not the king of Judea. He's a prophet, and he gives a prophecy. He shows his function here. He says you're going to be bound up. If he was the king, he could have told Paul not to go and commanded him not to go. But Paul said, "I'm ready to die if I have to." But it says prophet, right? He's not described as a king.
Well, some kings were prophets as well, just as Joseph was a prophet in Egypt.
Yeah, but where does it say he was a king, though? Where's his kingly action in Acts?
Because his name is Agabus, which is obviously Agbarus, because both of these people gave the famine relief to Judea in the late AD 40s.
Okay, but how's it obvious that Agabus is Agbarus? How's that obvious?
Because the wife of Agbarus was Queen Helena, and the person who gave this famine relief money to Judea was Queen Helena. And here it's saying that her husband, King Agabus, actually in the Latin, he's called Agabus.
Is Helena ever described as being Agabus as the prophet's wife?
Yes, in Moses of Corine.
Okay.
Moses of Corine says that Queen Helena was married to King Agbarus of Edessa.
But you're assuming prophet Agabus from Judea is that same person. I'm saying, where's your evidence that Agabus is actually Agabus? Because so far they sound like two different people. One's a king, one's a prophet, one's from Judea, one's from Edessa. Two different people.
No, not two different people. It's because Agabus, as you know, in the Greek means locust. And the Edessan monarchy were always called locusts because the various writers didn't actually like them, so they mocked them for being locusts. And of course, Agabus means locust. Exactly the same as within Josephus and other stories, they called them Arabs, which also means locust.
Well, wait. But Talmud, why would Luke mock the prophet here by calling him a name you're saying is intended to be mockery?
Because
why would Luke do that?
all of these documents were influenced by Rome, because when were these documents written? They were written in the AD 70s, as you know.
Well, no. I do not know that, and I can tell you why I don't know that. And I'm sure you've heard this argument, but it's helpful for the audience if they haven't. The book of Acts, which is under discussion, ends with Paul on house arrest when we know Paul died under Nero. He died under Neronian persecution.
Where did it say that?
His death is not included. That's my point. It doesn't say it, indicating when this was. No, that's the point.
It's like, not the point. It doesn't mention his death.
Let me give an example. It'd be like Revenge of the Sith. Let's not. I don't want to get too bogged down. But the point is, it doesn't mention his death because it hasn't happened yet, indicating it happened. This book is concluded prior to his death. So the evidence that you have is actually doesn't flow. And
no, it does flow.
And Acts is filled with accurate examples and representations of a lot of specific things that were specifically that time. Here's a great book on it, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Colin Himmer shows again and again and again, you have specific names that were and specific rulers and specific titles, but all kinds of things specific to a certain stage in history that match up. This is a wonderful book I recommend people to get. It's a little bit dry, but he gives example after example. None of it matches up with what you're saying. It sounds like you're setting the book of Acts in the entirely wrong historical timeline.
No, it does match up. We have Agabus, who's Agbarus, who's giving...
You have not established that, sir.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Who's married to Queen Helena, who gave the famine relief money to Judea. They come from Antioch, which is Antioch Edessa. That was the name of Edessa. And they were always called by the Talmud as well. They were called locusts, and of course Agabus does mean locusts. So we've got at least 4 or 5 pointers towards this being King Agbarus of Edessa. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you read on, this famine relief money was taken to Judea by Saul and Barnabas. So if this was talking about the king of Edessa, which many people think, not just myself, then it means that Saul was actually much more important than people will give him credit for, because he was the ambassador to Edessa. So he was not a tent maker. So why do they call him a tent maker? Well, because Queen Helena was famed for having the biggest Huqoq in the whole of Judea. And a Huqoq is a tent. So Saul probably was a tent maker, but he was a Huqoq maker for the festival of Sukkot, the festival of the tabernacles, as you know. So all of this does tie in together in multiple sources, in multiple directions. If you have an open mind and you can accept it.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a way to, set up psychologically people to, say, well, I should believe this, because Mr. Ellis says, if I'm open-minded, then I'll believe in his theory. But Mr. Ellis, I saw in your review of Eisenman, who you quoted, you said he wasn't open-minded enough. So he you quoted him in certain instances where he agrees with you, but in your review, you called out specifically, it's titled, Not Open-Minded Enough. Yeah, so, I mean, I guess a lot of us aren't open-minded enough. But here, are you saying that you've got Agabus being Abgarus the Fifth? Is that the same one you're identifying him with?
Yes, indeed. Died in about AD 50. So this is talking about the right era, because this famine was supposed to be AD 48.
Okay, so you have Josephus, who is really Paul, being told by the king if he goes to Jerusalem that he's going to be killed. But don't you say that Agabus is actually the king of Judea? If he's the king, why would he be warning him against going to the place where he's the king of and saying he's going to get killed there? Because that does not make sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, because he was not allowed to go there by Roman edict. The Romans
Then how's he the king?
Yeah, but Rome controlled that region, and Rome said, don't you dare go.
But it says he came down from Judea. What do you mean he wasn't allowed to go there? He said he came down from Judea in the text of Acts. So he was allowed to go there in the text you brought us to.
But it says the word is katachome, which means can
to descend,
come down or depart, or it can mean, in fact, in many cases, it's translated as the land. So it's not
a
necessarily
verb.
come down from.
It's a verb. In the root there is katothen, and it means to descend. Now, you said he wasn't allowed to go there, but how is he coming back from there if he's not allowed to go there on your theory?
It can also mean towards. So you can translate that.
If he's not allowed to go there, how can he be going towards it? Either way, you're in trouble. You said he's not allowed to go there.
His wife did. Queen Helena became the queen of Judea in the AD 50s.
No, don't. We're changing the subject now. You said Agabus is not allowed to go to Jerusalem, even though you're saying he's the king of Judea. If you look in verse 12, it says the people there urged him not to go up to Jerusalem. So
yes,
here precisely. you have the people hearing it saying, Paul, don't go because you'll be killed. Agabus, yes. Who you're saying is so, but notice you said Agabus he's warning him against going to a place that you're saying he's the king of. Wouldn't Agabus just be like, hey, Paul, if you want to go to Jerusalem, cool, I'm the king of it, I'll be in charge. But you say, no, he's not allowed to go there. But the text says he came down from Judea. How can he come from a place he wasn't allowed to be at?
If you read the other texts that talk about this, they say much the same thing in a slightly different fashion. They say that King Agabus of Edessa said he wants to come down to Judea to talk to Jesus, which is a problem because this is the AD 50s, of course. And then he was warned not to do so because that was against Roman law. So they're all talking about the same thing, and you're getting hung up on a single word when if you read the different versions, and there's like 5 different versions of this in the different texts, you will find a different interpretation.
Mr. Ellis, it says that Agabus came down from Judea. You just told us he was not allowed to be there.
Yes, you're harping on about one word.
Okay, so were you, it's okay, we all make mistakes, right? Are you saying you were mistaken that he was allowed to be there? Because it says he came down from there. And that's a phrase, by the way, not just one word. You said he's not allowed to be in Jerusalem. That's why he's warning Paul against going there, because he knows the Jews are going to hand him over. This is what the prophecy is about. Yeah, but you're saying he's not allowed to be there. But it says he came down from Judea.
Yeah, but what does down mean for you? Down would be what, south? Is that what you're saying? Is he going into Egypt? What does down mean?
It says he came down from Judea.
Yes. From Judea, okay. So
they're in Caesarea. They're in Caesarea right now. They're in Caesarea. He came down from Judea. So how can he come from a place he's not allowed to be at?
I will have to give you a complete analysis of that because, of course, the other texts that we have don't say that in the same fashion.
Can you give me an example so I can look at it? Because maybe you're right.
Well,
if you give me just one, I'll take a look at it and maybe I'll verify it and I'll say I'm sorry.
I'll probably give it to you after. It comes from documents like the Doctrine of Addai and things of that nature, which have the same sort of text.
You're saying they have the same account of Agabus the prophet warning Paul not to go to Jerusalem?
Yes, of course. Well, not in that terms, but it's talking about the same thing. It's talking about King Agabus writing letters down to Jesus.
Okay.
The story from.
Well, related to that.
But coming back to this, you haven't explained the other thing, which is, okay, if we're talking about a classical Saul, how was Saul persecuting people in Judea and Syria and committing them to prison if he was just a tent maker?
Okay.
See, you have problems with your classical interpretation as well. No,
I already mentioned this. At the time, he doesn't have to support himself as a tent maker. That's not what he's doing. He's not going all the way to Syria and saying, let me hook you up with a crib. He is saying, let me drag the Christian leaders and take them back to Jerusalem to be tried for crimes of heresy and blasphemy and all that kind of stuff. So that's easy. That's easy to explain. That doesn't really do anything. He's not described as a tent maker at this stage of his life. You're putting a detail from later on. He doesn't have the same job his whole life. When I was younger, I worked at Wendy's.
Yes, but you weren't.
But I don't work at Wendy's anymore. And so you might be like, how can you afford that Tahoe when you work at Wendy's? I'm like, well, I don't work at Wendy's anymore. It'd be reversed with Paul.
You weren't a policeman, were you? It says,
thank God, no.
It says, I persecuted this way unto death, binding and delivering into prison both.
Well, see, Mr. Ellis, that's a symbolic death.
Oh.
And see that death is tacked on later. If you read the sentence carefully, there's a breathing mark. So
now,
we don't take that serious, that part.
You don't believe in symbolism, so explain it then in
Mr. Ellis, I am being facetious. I'm using your methodology against you. I'm saying when you've got literal death, and I'm glad you can take it in good fun, you're okay with literal death in this instance. But when it seems clear in the text in other places, you say, well, that's tacked on.
Yes, but you believe in this in real terms, so explain it in real terms. How was Saul putting people to death? Under what authority?
Paul does breathe murderous threats.
Yes.
And he does bring him out to prison. And he describes himself as the chief of sinners. That's all true. But he says he did so with letters from the leaders in Jerusalem.
Acts 22:4. But yes, so under what authority? So he was a policeman then working for the authorities in Jerusalem, yes?
I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women,
yes,
as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those who also are there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. Now, at the time he was doing this, was Agabus king of Jerusalem, but not allowed there?
Well, that's a different matter because he was under an edict from Rome. So that's a different matter. The point is
edict from
Saul,
Rome? Where does it say that?
That in real history, you've got to read Procopius and various other.
Wait! You're saying Procopius is going to say that Paul was persecuting Christians on behalf of Rome?
That, King Agabus was under Roman restrictions. I think there are many manuscripts that say even the Doctrine of Addai, I think, says that King Agabus of Edessa was under Roman restrictions. But the point here is talking about Saul. If Saul was Josephus, then we know exactly how he became the policeman in charge of Judea and, this says Syria all the way up to Damascus, because Saul was the army commander in charge of Galilee, as you know.
Well, Mr. Ellis, being a cop and being a general are two very different things.
No, not in those times.
You can't have Paul persecuting these kind of religious legal matters on behalf of folks in Jerusalem and equate that with Josephus' job as a general.
Josephus was appointed by the high priesthood in Jerusalem to police Judea and as far as Gamala in the north. And what he was doing is he was persecuting a guy called Jesus of Gamala, Saphias, and he was chasing him and jailing him all over Galilee at that time.
So Paul was actually chasing Jesus.
Well, he was. Saul,
but why doesn't it say that? It says, I persecuted this way. It doesn't say I was chasing Jesus.
Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who said that?
Jesus from heaven.
Well, yes, if you believe in heavens, but we're talking about real.
Well, okay, let's just take. Okay, I understand. From what I've heard, you're saying you don't believe in heaven, but you do believe in magic stones. From what I've read in relationship to something that Scotland is supposed to have.
No, I don't.
Okay, then maybe I misunderstood about the magic stone.
Well, this is detractors. You don't believe detractors. I mean,
okay.
This is the first rule of anything to do.
I'll take your my mistake.
I talk about these magic stones. Well, they're not magic; they're magnetic. I talk about.
I understand.
Them. That doesn't mean that you believe in them.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, in relationship to this, in the account, Jesus is described as being the risen Lord and speaking to him in a very way that's reminiscent of the way an Old Testament prophet would have a vision. And as I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth. But of course, Ralph, you would need him to say, I am the king of Edessa, whom you are persecuting. So he's described there
at that time. He wouldn't have been king at that time, I don't think.
But do you believe where do you believe Jesus is speaking from? Because it says a great light from heaven shone around me. So how's
That's only if
Jesus?
you believe in heavens. I don't believe in these spiritual.
Well, Paul seemed to
attributes.
believe in heaven. He says he even got caught up to it. So what do you think Paul is saying here? Is he actually saying that the king of Edessa approached him on, I'm sorry, the prince at this time, under your theory, the prince of Edessa approached him and said, stop chasing me? And why would Paul just suddenly stop chasing him when his quarry is right in front of him?
Josephus says exactly the same when he was imprisoned in, self-imprisoned in Jotapata when he was being attacked by the Romans. And he says exactly the same thing. He says that he had a vision of a man telling him the error of his ways and he ought to change his ways in exactly the same fashion as this Saul having his little
Could I look at that reference?
Revelation. Sorry?
That reference is in Josephus. I got Josephus. Where are you saying it is?
Oh gosh, that's going to take me a while to pick that out.
Because I'm a little worried maybe something else is going on there. I'm not saying for sure. It's good to always verify, right? And
yes, but I don't want to take ages looking this up for people. Let me see if I can pull out my book, because that's going to be the easiest way to find it.
If you find it, let me know, because it might be something different. But you're saying,
it's a very simple passage. He was imprisoned in Jotapata because they were defeated by the Romans, and so they retreated into some sort of underground cell. And then he says, because he wants to surrender to the Romans, and the people he's with don't want to surrender to the Romans, and he has this vision of a man saying that you should basically go over to the Romans, surrender and go over to the Romans. But his compatriots don't want to. And so he devises this wonderful little scheme where everybody commits suicide. But
you're talking about, and he's the only guy who doesn't. He tricks him.
Yeah, okay. One who doesn't, because he's choosing who commits suicide. He ends up as the last man standing.
Right. So I know that story, but how's that the same story of what you're telling me? I know he kind of did a little sellout there, tricked them and all that. Okay, but that's in a cave.
Yes. And
but you said he was in prison or in jail,
telling him of the error of his ways, and he should go over to the Romans. And I don't know quite how I can find this in a quick hurry for you.
Let's see, anyway, Jewish Wars of the Jews, Book 3.
Oh, probably.
Chapter 8. Let's see here. But are you saying that this is the same account of Paul with the risen Jesus?
I can't say it's the same account. It's a very similar account, and you find these very similar events at time and time again that confirm that Saul was the Josephus character, the same as we find that Saul was on a ship that was shipwrecked going to Rome in order to see Nero. And of course, Josephus was shipwrecked on a ship going to Rome to go and see Nero. Both of those were prison ships as well. And they were at the same time. They were both in about AD 62. So we have these very close connections between these two characters. So from your point of view, do you think that's just coincidence that they're both on the same ship?
Well, I'd have to look at it, because I feel like when you look at a text, you see connections that maybe someone with a different methodology or historiography would not see. And so I'm not assuming that the framing is correct there. And I'm sure you know that there was a lot of people who went on ships to Rome and got shipwrecked, even in that year. So that's not really relevant, especially when they have two different names. And Saul is from Tarsus. Josephus is not from Tarsus. Saul stuttered under Gamaliel. Josephus did not stutter under Gamaliel. You've got to import Josephus's biography onto Paul's life, or vice versa, for this thing to work. You've got to have was Josephus of the tribe of Benjamin? I don't believe that he was. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and that's something I could say. I was wrong about that.
To the Hasmoneans, but I mean, there are many similarities. You're looking at the things that don't quite connect, but how about looking at the things that do connect?
You're asking me to buy into your theory with that.
Oh no, this is to fully explore something. You explore the negatives and the positives, and one of the positives, of course, is they both had the same publisher, Epaphroditus. Is that a coincidence that they were both using Epaphroditus, and it seems to be the same Epaphroditus in both cases?
Can you explain to me? Can you tell me where the sources are for that? That they both had the same publisher?
Well, it comes from Acts of the Apostles. Where's Epaphroditus mentioned?
I'm trying to see some of the connections.
2:25. Epaphroditus, my brother, and
okay. So where does it say he's his publisher there?
Because, well, in Josephus Flavius, he salutes him as being a fellow traveler in this scheme of theirs, which is writing these books. It's pretty obvious that Epaphroditus was working with him, because the thing is that Joseph
fellow worker. You're correct about that. Worker. But where's this idea of publisher?
Well, because Josephus couldn't speak Greek very well, and he needed someone to translate these books into Greek. They were not written in Greek in the first place. They were written in Aramaic, as he makes very clear. And since Josephus couldn't write Greek very well, he needed someone in order to assist him. And it's quite obvious that that person was Epaphroditus, in which case I call him his publisher. If you're writing these books, Josephus wrote enormous books, as you know. He would have a whole team of scribes doing this. He would have a whole scriptorium and a publishing empire in order to print these books. It was very expensive. And he was distributing these books, firstly to Edessa. All of the first books he wrote about the Jewish war went to Edessa. The Babylonian Jews beyond the Euphrates. And the subsequent books he was trying to give to the Romans to prove that, because he said there were errors running abroad about the Jewish revolt, and he wanted to correct those errors. And so the second load of books went to Greece and to Rome.
We don't have evidence that all these Epaphroditus are the same people. We've got one that Josephus dedicates his book Antiquities of the Jews. So I'm looking up now. And we have another one, and maybe this is the one you're conflating with all three being the same person, who was a secretary of Nero.
Yes, which could be the same person again.
Yeah, but just because they have the same name doesn't mean they're the same person. And here's the thing. Do you believe that Paul was executed under Nero?
No, there is no evidence, is there? What's your evidence that he was?
I mean...
Well, come on. What's your evidence? What's your evidence?
So there's a few things. One is, as I mentioned before, Acts closes with Paul still alive.
Yeah, that's
but he's under lock and key during that time. But then later on, you have pretty early church tradition that talks about Paul being executed under Nero.
Yeah, that's not evidence from that era.
Well, some of the hold on. If we're going to do that, you understand that first of all, Josephus. Well, okay, you're shifting over the whole date, which is wild. But you would have other things you've drawn from so far that are not contemporaneous to this time, especially like the Talmud. You've done that several times, and the Talmud is kind of completed for time of the Babylonian time in 500 AD.
Yes,
but nonetheless,
we'll argue about that. Yes,
but nonetheless, my point by bringing that up is he's working with Nero, and you're making him work with Paul. But it's not even clear that that's the same Epaphroditus, and it's not even clear that Josephus is Paul. That's probably the biggest problem that we have here with all that, and all this is really tied into your theories. And if you take out one of them, it creates some other big problems with your theories. If you wanted to just slide over the dates of the New Testament, I guess, that might be an interesting escapade. But the fact that you conflate so many persons of history, where you take 2 or 3 or 4 people and put them into one, that's where you really get your problems, because it seems as if you're willing to take people with similar names, say they're definitely the same people, if the names are similar or in some cases identical. But Mr. Ellis, you are willing to take people whose names, biographies are not similar at all and say they're the same person simply because their lives have some element of parallel that you believe you found.
No, with the Saul Josephus connection, I have about 15 parallels between the two. So this is not a simple comparison of one or two events. I have a whole series of events that link these two characters
Did
together.
Josephus study under Gamaliel?
He has a very similar story with a different name, so we're not sure on that. Yeah, of course, with all of these elements, you will find one or two contradictions, and you're picking out the contradictions, which is a good thing. You're showing the opposite point of view. But there are, I give you at least 15 comparisons between these two characters. So I don't connect them lightly. And the other point is that it makes sense of the story. You have a classical story of Saul, where this guy is completely missing from the historical record.
Well, no, he's not. But can I show you some more problems with the Josephus thing? Josephus, because I just wanted to confirm. Remember, I asked you earlier if he was a Levi or a Benjamite. The answer is no, he's not. He's from the tribe of Levi. But yet, in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, Paul says he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Yeah. So how can Josephus and Paul be the same person if one is a Levite and one is a Benjamite? That's not a minor difference.
Well, yeah, but as you know, the genealogy of Jesus is completely different in two of the Gospels.
Well, I'm not asking about Jesus. I'm asking about Paul and Josephus.
This is how the Gospels are not entirely accurate.
I'm reading from Philippians, not a gospel. Yeah. Everything you're saying is irrelevant to my question to you, sir.
No, the whole of the gospel story is not necessarily fixed in stone. So you're quoting something from Philippians. I'm quoting a genealogy from the rest of the synoptic gospels. And the two genealogies do not match. So the fact that we have a genealogy that doesn't match does not prove that Saul.
This is not a genealogy. This is Paul when he's giving his pre-Christian credentials. Says I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. Josephus, by his own account, says that his father was a Jewish priest. He's a Levite. But how do you explain that these two people you're saying are one have two different dads and are from two different tribes? What's your explanation?
How do you know he was quoting his father's line? As you know, genealogy.
Josephus says his mother was also a Levite. He says his and
sure?
yes. Let's see here.
I'm not entirely sure that he does. But as you know, these genealogies are not precise. The genealogy of Jesus proves that. And he's supposed to be an even more important character than Saul is. And they still can't get the genealogy of Jesus to be the same.
But we're asking about Josephus here. We're asking about Josephus, right?
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So here's another a difference. Here. Okay, it looks like I'm not sure if she's a Levite, but she is from a royal ruling family.
Yes, we know. She was Hasmonean.
Aristocratic, but I do believe she was a Levite as well. But I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't
think they're Levites.
But see, you should have looked this up to confirm your theory. And here I'm telling you, one's a Levite, one's a Benjamite. You don't have a ready answer. Not only that, but you have other problems here with this Josephus Paul thing, namely that they have two different names.
Yes, but Paul, Paul just means the junior. So Paul is not a name. That's just his position. He's the junior. He's the younger brother. And Saul, Josephus could not use his name when he was writing about himself in some of these texts. You'll find this problem all the time, that certain names have been deleted. We get this from Josephus when he's talking about the Edessans. So very quickly, when he talks about the Edessans, when Aretas was attacking Tetrarch Antipas, Josephus says that Aretas of Petra was joined by some fugitives from Syria. And so he's not giving the name of this alternative army that helped Aretas of Petra. And then you go to Moses of Corinne, who has exactly the same story. And he says it was the Edessan army that helped Aretas of Petra defeat Tetrarch Antipas. So we have two stories. And in the Josephan story, he deliberately deletes the people who were in this battle. he will not mention Edessa. And that is a problem that we find all the way through his works. You can do a search of the works of Josephus, and he never mentions Edessa. He never mentions Abgarus. He never mentions Manu. He never mentions anything to do with the Edessan monarchy.
Right, but that's not a problem for us. It's a problem for you.
Right? It's a problem for us because he may well be mentioning these people all the way through his works, and you would not know about it because he's using pseudonyms.
But you know.
Well, I know because, well, we know he is missing out this particular monarchy. He's not mentioning them.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of places he doesn't mention, though, Mr. Ellis.
Sorry?
There's a lot of places Josephus doesn't mention, but that doesn't mean there's some secret code that tells you how they really are there. Well, here's the other thing with this. Josephus is a Sadducee. What is Paul, though? What's his affiliation? Not a Sadducee, but a...
What? No. Well, we can talk about this later because they seem to
what's the
change
answer?
their minds. Well, no, there is no guaranteed answer.
Philippians 3, he says a Pharisee of Pharisees.
Yes, but he also has elements of Sadducee as well. You know
he calls himself a Pharisee. Josephus is a Sadducee. How are they the same person?
They change their alliances. You know that the things he says are allied to both of them. The people we're talking about, the Jesus of Gamala, they were the sons of Zadok, and so they should be Sadducees, as you know, the Zadoks. But they are not always allied with the Zadoks. There were obviously shifting alliances, and you can see that in the text. So putting that forward as a black and white, question is simply not fair. You know that they had shifting alliances. They're not always talking in Pharisee terms. I can point you to articles that point that out, but I don't want to get bogged down in minutiae of these texts. But I think I've demonstrated to you sufficiently that there are a number of links between Josephus and Saul which indicate they might be linked. And if that is the case, then we are talking about a later date for the gospel story.
Okay, two things about that, though, Mr. Ellis. Paul, later on, cannot even go into Jerusalem unless he's willing to be bound and perhaps killed. We've been over that passage relating to Agabus. But if he's a Sadducee, he should be okay to go into Jerusalem, if he's actually Josephus. Because that's something to bring up, too. But not only that, in Acts 23:6, he says, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Two things about that. Number one, he declares to a body of Pharisees and Sadducees, he affiliates as a Pharisee and as a son of Pharisees. Josephus is not a son of Pharisees. So more problems for your theory. And then he proclaims resurrection of the dead. Mr. Ellis, did Sadducees believe in a bodily resurrection of the dead?
Mr. Vocab, you know full well that Saul was the apostle to the Gentiles. So we're talking about a completely different church here. He was
church. He's on trial here.
Yeah, he was on trial for preaching against against Judaism, wasn't he? When Saul was put into prison, he was put into prison for preaching texts which were against Judaism. That's why he was put into jail, because he was the apostle to the Gentiles. You know, he became the apostle to the Gentiles. He was promoting a Rome-friendly form of Judaism, which the Jerusalem authorities didn't like. That's why they put him in prison. So you know that he was not just simply a Pharisee. So asking me that question is a trick.
You didn't answer the question, and you know very well Sadducees did not believe in the bodily resurrection of the dead, but he's proclaiming the bodily resurrection of the dead. So he's not Josephus the Sadducee. That's all I'm saying. He's not.
But he was Saul the apostle to the Gentiles, which is something completely different.
Amen.
So he set up a Rome-friendly form of Judaism, which I call simple Judaism, the Church of Saul, which was completely different, of course, to the Church of Jesus and James. They actually became enemies, as you know. And who within history of this region became very Rome-friendly? Yes, that would be Josephus, wouldn't it? Who was also very Rome friendly. Again, we see similarities between these two people. Now, in some senses, this doesn't change the Christian story. I mean, you're hanging on to this traditional view of Christianity with the AD 30s crucifixion.
Well, you're hanging on to your theory from your books, though. Well, so to be fair,
you can say that, but my story doesn't actually change that story very much whatsoever. All it means is the date slips by 40 years, and then we place this Jesus character in a place where we can find characters who are very similar to the Jesus character. For instance, the Edessan king, who was the leader of the Jewish revolt, his name was Jesus Manu, Jesus Emmanuel. And he wore a crown of thorns because the traditional crown of the Edessan monarchy was a crown of thorns. Again, we get these elements of the same story flowing through it.
I was hoping you weren't going to go here. So there's no relationship between Yeshua and if you're going to say it's the Persian, the only similarity is in their English transliteration, not actually. We can't do sound alike equals the same.
Well, yes, you can, because what's Jesus called in Arabia? What's in Arabic? What's his name?
No, so that's a mistake made by Muhammad that you should not follow. Isa bin Maryam. Isa bin Maryam is not what. I'm going to give evidence to this. If you know Arabic speaking Christians, they don't call him Isa because they understand that just means Esau. They call him Yesu or Yeshua. That's Jesus in Arabic. Muhammad misnamed Jesus, and Muslims fall to this day. But Christians who speak Arabic know it's not right. So you're making a mistake that Muhammad made. No, Isa bin Maryam is incorrect. Now, it is how Muslims identify him, but it's not the proper way to say his name in Arabic.
So you say, but when I was
no, this is something I know directly. So I attended an Arabic church for quite some time and still have a number of friends who are Arabic speakers from a number of places, especially Syria, Egypt, and Assyria, which has no country, but from where the Assyrians are in the Middle East. When you talk to them about this, they'll tell you this. This is not really a debatable point. That Isa bin Maryam is it's something you shouldn't follow Muhammad in his mistake.
No, when I was in Syria, everybody called Jesus Issa. That was the general name they gave.
Yeah, that's because they're Muslims, so they're going to follow Muhammad's mistake, just like they think Alexander the Great is in the Quran. There's all kinds of mistakes he makes, like Jesus speaking from the crib, Jesus not getting crucified. You might actually like that one. All kinds of mistakes in the Quran that you don't want to follow.
Names, then you're admitting that people can have different names.
No, I'm admitting that Muhammad had another misunderstanding in relation to who Jesus was, including his name, and that's why he called him Isa, but it's not correct Arabic because he did not really understand what he was looking at. Everything Muhammad is doing is hearing stuff. By their own admission, he's illiterate, so he's not reading some text. In fact, at that time, we don't have any evidence that there was full New Testament translations in Arabic during that time in 7th century Arabia when he's coming up with these things in the cave. So that's not what it is. It would be Yesu, not Isa. So it's not correct. But that has that's way over here. That has nothing to do with back here making Jesus the king of Edessa.
Oh, well, it would, because they were influenced, of course, mainly by the East, not so much by the West. Remember, Edessa is in Mesopotamia. It's across the Euphrates, so it's not very close to Judea. So, yeah, they had different influences there. And remember that the Edessan church in India also calls him Issa. They use the same title. And as far as I know, that comes from the original Edessans who went to India, not from the Arabic traditions from later times. There was a tradition that Jesus was called Issa. And the reason they got that name is because his original name was Isis, which was a Persian-type Parthian name. It wasn't a Judean name. And
so you brought up when you were in Syria, right? And is it true, you're talking about, you heard different speakers and stuff. Is it true that, is this true or is this something that's not true? That there is some younger boys who were giggling and laughing and you asked them why, and they said it's because you look like Issa? Is that true?
Yes, that's true.
So some Arabic speaking boys in Syria were laughing because when you asked them why, it's because you look like Jesus Christ.
Yeah, because he was ginger haired. Yeah.
But you don't have any hair. Did you have hair at the time?
Oh, no, he wasn't talking about me. He was talking about his friend. His friend was ginger. I was sort of laughing at his friend because his friend had very ginger hair. He was Syrian. So
did his friend have a beard?
No, he didn't have a beard. He had ginger
But you
hair.
say that Jesus was ginger with a beard, and you use an image that is most likely Alexander the Great from the 5th century, and yet you claim it's one of the earliest images of Jesus. Why do you do that, Mr. Ellis?
Because that's not Alexander the Great. Have you seen the image? Can I do
Yes, I have. I actually have seen the image, and ironically, I have it right here on my phone, said image. It's right here. Now, that's from the 5th century. So why would you say it's one of the earliest images of Jesus if it's from the 5th century?
Well, they don't know the exact time. They date it between the 3rd and the 5th centuries.
Okay. So that's not one of the earliest images of Jesus, though. We have images of Jesus much earlier, and he's usually portrayed as a bearded youth in those instances. Is he not?
No, in Rome, he's normally clean shaven if you go to Rome.
I'm sorry, did I say bearded? Beardless.
Yes,
excuse me, you are correct about that. A beardless youth.
Yeah,
my point was that.
Indicating that he looks like Apollo, of course. But if you
there is subversion of the Greek gods in some of the early Christian art. Don't deny that. But my point is, you're saying the earliest image is this, but it's not the earliest image. That's the whole point of why I brought that to you. So why do you say this is the earliest image?
It's one of the earliest images we have of Jesus.
But it's from the 5th century. We have things that are earlier than that.
Can I?
I see it. It's on the screen.
Okay. Because again, like you, I can't see that it's actually. I can't see that it's sharing. Okay, so this is the Huqoq mosaic. This is what we're talking about, and this was claimed to be an image of Alexander the Great, but it's quite obviously not Alexander the Great because he is wearing a Jewish payot, a side lock of hair. You can see on the side of his head there, he's wearing a side lock of hair. Alexander the Great was never bearded, and he wouldn't have worn a Jewish side lock of hair. So here we have a character who's obviously not Alexander the Great. So who is this character? He is Bar Kamsa from the Talmud. If you look up your story of Bar Kamsa, Bar Kamsa was the leader of the Jewish revolt. We're back at the Jewish revolt again, who was said to have given a sacrificial calf from Emperor Nero to the high priest of Jerusalem. And that's exactly what we see here. We have this king, and he is a king because he's wearing a diadem, a headband, and he's giving a sacrificial calf to the high priest of Jerusalem. And he was doing so in order to provoke the Jewish revolt, because he wanted this sacrificial calf to be refused by the high priesthood, because the calf was Gentile, and of course it would be refused by the high priesthood, which it was, which was done in order to anger Nero and precipitate the Jewish revolt. And you can see his army on the right-hand side here that's ready for battle. And at the bottom, well, you can't see it at the bottom here, but underneath, you can see this army was defeated. So we know that this is not Alexander the Great, because the army of Alexander the Great was never defeated, and he would not have worn a Jewish payot, side lock of hair. So who is this character? He is known as Bar Kamsa, the son of the locust. We're talking about locusts again. So quite obviously, he is, as the leader of the Jewish revolt, he is the king of Adiabeni Edessa, because they are linked or the same city. So he is the leader of the revolt, and he's dressed here in sort of Roman armor with a purple cloak. You remember the purple cloak from the crucifixion story, where Jesus was wearing a purple cloak? Why was he doing so? Well, because he was dressed as a king of Edessa. That's why we have this story. So we have these multiple links which you are not sort of looking at. But this is, if that's the case, then this, at the very, very least, This is the king of Edessa who was involved in the Jewish revolt. His name was Manu, Isis Manu. And if my theory is correct, then this is an image of Jesus, because he would have been the leader of the Jewish revolt. And note, he is ginger-haired. So we do have Syrian Mesopotamian people, because that, Edessa is in Mesopotamia. We do have Mesopotamians who are ginger-haired. It was a phenotype in that era. So that is just simply more evidence that my theory is correct. And I'm sure you want to jump in there.
Yeah. There's elephants there.
Yes, there's elephants, yes.
Yeah. There's no Bible stories with elephants. Those battle elephants are associated with Greek armies like Alexander the Great.
Yeah, but Alexander the Great didn't wear a Jewish sidelock of hair, and his army wasn't defeated. So we know.
Well, almost certainly, this is a depiction, which is probably a Jewish legend, where Alexander the Great meets the Jewish high priest. I'm sure you know that. In fact, this appears in Paul's writings. I mean, Josephus's writings, and in rabbinic literature. Yes.
Yeah, but it's quite obviously not Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was never bearded.
Wait,
and he wouldn't
quite
wear
obviously
a sidelock of hair. Why has he got a sidelock of hair?
Well, hold on. You've got Jesus. You have Jesus, right? Who's sometimes portrayed bearded and sometimes beardless. So that's not going to do anything. Only in Rome,
because they depicted him as Apollo. But as a Nazarene, of course, he would not be beardless. A Nazarene was not allowed to pull their hair, as you know.
Okay, so this is from the Huqoq synagogue, correct?
Yes.
Okay, they're going to portray Jesus. A synagogue is going to have an image of Jesus.
Well, Jesus was a Jew, you know that.
Yeah, he was considered a blasphemer who should be boiled in semen and feces, according to the Talmud. So I don't think they're going to have an image of him portraying him in a good old-fashioned kind of, this is a good guy kind of way.
This is obviously a Nazarene synagogue, because it has a zodiac on the floor. If you look at the other mosaics in the synagogue, it has a big zodiac on the floor. Now, the traditional Judean synagogues would not have zodiacs on the floor. Only the very esoteric ones would do, like the Nazarene, like the Hamatzvera zodiac on the Sea of the Shores of Galilee.
This evidence he's defeated in battle, what's your evidence again for that? I'm trying to understand.
It's the... unfortunately, they didn't release the mosaic beneath this one, but beneath this one, there is another mosaic which has this army being defeated. But they didn't release it, so I don't have that picture.
Okay, well, I'm not sure about that, but in this picture, he's not being defeated. In fact, one side has weapons, the other side has scrolls. Who do you think is going to win that battle?
And swords. Remember, the priesthood have got swords.
You got a couple young dudes with no armor on. They're going to defeat this guy with his war elephants. It's like Lord of the Rings out here.
No. They weren't defeated by these people. This is a depiction of the start of the Jewish revolt. This is the event that created the Jewish revolt, because it upset Nero, and therefore it precipitated the Jewish revolt. After the Jewish revolt, of course, which was won by Rome, not by the priesthood, this army was defeated because they lost the war against Rome. That's why they were crucified in AD 70, because they lost the Jewish revolt, and therefore the army was defeated.
But this story appears in Josephus, and it's Alexander the Great meeting.
Yeah, but only
meeting with the Jewish high priest. I mean, it's depicting what was in Josephus. So why are you saying you're trying to make it an event that no one records ever happening when Josephus actually records this event?
No, we know this event happened. It's in the Talmud. Look up the story of Bar Kamsa in the Talmud.
But
it's exactly this. It's exactly this story.
Okay, I got to be honest. I probably doubt that, but you have never established Bar Kamsa is Jesus, and you definitely haven't established that Jesus. I mean, you got to understand, part of your theory here is that Jesus is a white guy with red hair.
Yeah, and?
I mean, that's good old Anglo-Israelism, man.
No, not at all. I mean, who's this guy?
I know it's Ramses, but now why are we
Ramesses
going over to
II,
Egyptians?
yeah.
I mean, let's show the Nubian pharaohs then and see how you fare.
Yeah, I'm sure you can find the negative, but I'm looking at the positive.
What's negative about Nubian pharaohs, dude?
This is Ramesses II, and he was taken to Paris for preservation. And
he's buried in Paris, therefore he's the king of Paris, right?
No, they determined at the forensic labs there.
No, you're missing what I'm saying. You make an argument like that where you've got someone being buried in a place and therefore they were the queen of it.
I'm saying that he's ginger-haired. Who's this one? This is Cleopatra.
Okay.
She was ginger-haired. Who's this guy?
Supposed to be the great grandson of Muhammad. I know. I've seen these pictures.
Yes, and so
Muhammad is actually described in the Hadith as a white man. So, and now, what was he literally a white man or not is another question, or is that symbolic? But this does not answer the question about Jesus, the Jew, running around like Conor McGregor in the Middle East.
What it's proving is that these Mesopotamians can be white and ginger. This is a descendant of Muhammad. This is Muhammad al-Yaqubi.
It would make sense if it was Alexander, a European, being pictured. It doesn't make sense for Jesus. And it seems like you're working hard to try to turn Jesus into a white guy with red hair.
I'm not trying anything. These are Muslims. They are trying. They paint their hair ginger because they want to look like Muhammad. Why do they do that?
Well, then they should also marry a 6-year-old girl, but that has nothing to do with Jesus.
Because they think that Muhammad was ginger. That's why they do it. It's not me that's saying this. This is Muslims themselves who are saying it. And of course,
that has nothing to do with Alexander the Great's painting. And that guy probably plays great bass guitar. He looks like he's in a band or something. But what I'm saying is, bro, is this Jesus theory is no good evidence for it. Everything about this picture screams Alexander the Great with his war elephants meeting Jewish high priests, which is exactly a legend portrayed in Josephus. And you're turning it into something that there's no textual data for unless you switch names around and ignore things that are present in the image. And frankly, this is why no one thinks that. And when you've presented it in the past, you have been a bit slippery with the facts. This is the 5th century. It is not one of the earliest images of Jesus. I think you know that good and well. I have a great book I recommend to you called Face to Face by Robin Jensen, and it's Portraits of the Divine in Early Christianity. And in it, you have the Good Shepherd Catacomb of Callistus in Rome. You have all kind of early Christian images, the baptism of Christ. That's also in the same place. That's what that one is called. And it's important. I would encourage you to look these up. There's other biblical figures portrayed as well. Now we have 4th century Musea Pio Cristiano in Vatican City is Jesus healing and working wonders. You have that. These are all before your 5th century image of something that you're telling people is one of the earliest images of Jesus. Mr. Ellis, with all due respect, don't you see how that really calls into question your credibility and even character? When you tell us a 5th century image of Alexander the Great is one of the earliest images of Jesus, even if you think it is Jesus, it's not one of the earliest images, my friend. It's not. You should stop saying that.
Well, it's from the 3rd century. There are not many that
wait. 3rd century? Where's your evidence it's from the 3rd century here in this synagogue?
Well, I'd have to look that up for you, but they found some coins underneath it. So
well, Jody Magnus, professor North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who has a great book that I actually own in my library about Jesus and dirt and spit and all that. It's about this kind of stuff. It's a great stuff. And she has a lot of great work on that. She doesn't think so. And she's not the only one. I mean, the Israel Antiquities Authority, they don't think that. And I think they have good reasons. I don't think you have good reasons for what you're saying.
Sorry, I'm just busy looking something up. What you're disputing here is what this image is actually showing, which is what.
No, you're disputing it. I'm going along with experts who this is what they do. You're disputing it. I'm disputing what you say, but you're the one disputing what everyone knows about it. And again, it's not one of the earliest ones. You have a bust of Christ, Catacomb of Commedia, mid to late 4th century. I've got the picture right here.
All those already.
No, I didn't. I did not mention that one. I'm laying it on at this point. You have the Mosaic portrait of Christ at Roman Via Hinton, St. Mary, and that's from the late 4th century. The reason why I'm laying these on is I'm showing you that these are all before the 5th century. You should not be saying, even if you thought it was Jesus, it's one of the earliest images of him. It's very dishonest. We have the statue of seated Christ, which is mid 4th century at the National Museum there in Rome, and that's supposed to be Christ as well. These are all before the 5th century, all of them. I'm sorry, 5th century. I'm not sure if I said 4th or 5th century. What's your evidence this is from the, what's your evidence this is earlier than the 5th century?
I would have to look that up because it...
But why do you say it if you don't know it?
Well, I do know it. I've written nearly 3,000 pages on this. I can't remember everything I've written. I'm just going to tell you what this actual scene is from. Now, Jody Magnus, as you said that this was an image of Alexander the Great, and you back up her by saying, yes, this is an image of Alexander the Great. It's not. It comes from the Talmud, and this is by Yohanan ben Zakkai. Anyway, he was the leader of the Jewish peoples after the Jewish revolt. And Yohanan said he went to the emperor, so he's going to Nero. And he said, the rebels are rebelling against you. And Nero said, how can I tell? And he said to him, send them an offering and see whether they will offer it upon the altar. So Yohanan sent with Bar Kamsa with a fine calf as an offering. While on the way, Bar Kamsa made a blemish on its upper lip, or as some say, on the white of its eye. Rabbis were inclined to offer it in order not to offend the government, the Roman government. But Rabbi Zechariah Abculus said to them, well, people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. And then they proposed to kill Bar Kamsa, this particular guy, so he would not go and inform against them. Again, Rabbi Zechariah prevented that. And so they said, through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves are exiled from our land. That's from Gittin 55 to 57. And that equates exactly with this scene here. It is quite obviously a scene involving Bar Kamsa giving the sacrificial calf to the high priest of Jerusalem.
So you're telling me that the Jewish high priest is going to accept a sacrificial calf from Nero?
No, that's the whole idea. They wanted him to reject it, and he did.
Okay, so that's what this is portraying here?
Yes.
So why would Jesus take a blemished calf?
To start the Jewish revolt.
So Jesus knew this would upset them?
Of course, because as a king of Edessa, it wouldn't make sense in your terms because you're thinking of Jesus as being a poor carpenter who's not involved in politics. These people were involved in politics. The idea of the Edessan monarchy was not over to take over Judea. They wanted to take over Rome because the throne of Rome became empty 2 years later. And of course, the purple cloak that he is wearing here is the cloak of the Emperor of Rome. And therefore, it's pretty obvious from this picture that he is a pretender to the throne of Rome. That's why he's wearing a purple cloak. This was not a simple revolt within Judea. This was a bid for the throne of Rome. And of course, within the Jewish revolt, the battle was between Vespasian and the Edessan Adiabene monarchy. They had this big battle in Judea, and the victor of that battle would sail to Rome as the next emperor.
If Jesus is working with Josephus, Paul, who's cozy with Rome, why does he want to rebel against Rome?
No, he wants to take over Rome. So we have opposition here. We have the rebel king who wants to take over Judea and Rome, and we have the Saul Josephus character who is working for Rome and therefore against this particular king. Remember that Saul changed sides. Saul and Josephus both changed sides. And so they were both being duplicitous, and they were working against this king because... Well, I
And
suppose
this,
in a way they were.
this is the true. This is, according to you, Mr. Ellis, the true foundation of Christianity. Has nothing to do with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, or an early church started out of Jerusalem. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's actually a military coup by someone who later became a king, and then later was the basis for the legends of King Arthur.
Yeah, but you've got to remember that this king is not the foundation of Christianity. Jesus was never a Christian. He was a Nazarene Jew. The Christianity came from Saul, not from Jesus. Christianity has nothing to do with Jesus.
So you believe Jesus was taken down from the cross, though? Jesus, the redheaded white guy, taken down from the cross by Paul, aka Josephus, and then he was banished to Britain, and then when he was in Britain, he became the basis for the Arthurian legends. Is this correct?
Yeah, you're moving on a little bit here from what we're talking about, but yes, the leaders of the Jewish revolt were banished, and they were taken to prison in Rome initially. What Josephus doesn't tell us is what happened to them after that time. I think, and there's good reason for thinking this. Remember, Arthurian legend, there's about 6,000 pages of Arthurian legend. It's a huge, great manual. When the Crusaders went to the East in 1098, where did they go to first of all? The first place they went to was Edessa. They didn't go to Jerusalem. They went to Edessa. What did they find in Edessa? I think they found the history of this particular king, the king we can see on the screen here. This is King.
Why did they go to Edessa, do you believe, Mr. Ellis?
Well, there's only two options. There is a story that they were invited there, but I think they probably had information that Edessa was central to this story. Because remember, Edessa is across the Euphrates. This is in Mesopotamia.
So I thought this information was lost, though, but you're saying they had an inside track that there was something there that they should find?
Yeah, why not? I mean, traditions can run down many centuries through these royal families.
So they brought a whole army to Edessa just to find the secret history of Jesus the King.
If you thought you were related to this particular king, then of course you would. So they went to Edessa. We know they went to Edessa. And the question is then, what did they find when they went to Edessa? And of course,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear one thing you said. I know I interrupted you. I apologize for that. You said who was related to what king? I missed that. Could you please say that again?
Count Baldwin of Boulogne, if he had been related to this particular king we can see here, the king of Edessa.
So you believe that this count you're talking about was related to Jesus?
Well, we don't know. But
you're saying he thought he might have been? I'm just trying to track him. Okay.
Of course.
So he thought he might have been. So do you believe Jesus had offspring?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Do you not?
Mr. Ellis, do you believe that you're related to Jesus Christ?
No. Why should I?
No? Well, because you believe that I think you look like him.
Oh, yeah, indeed. I'm a bit bolder than that. It's quite obvious that Jesus did have children. He was married to Mary Magdalene. Do you not believe that? Why do you not?
Oh, yeah. And that's something I kind of got a bone to pick with you. You quoted from the Gospel of Philip about, you said Jesus would often kiss Mary on the lips. But if you've ever seen that manuscript of the Gospel of Philip, Mr. Ellis, you would know there's a lacuna there. Yeah, and the lacuna is a hole. It's a physical. Yeah, it's a physical hole. So it doesn't say lips. It says and there's a hole. We don't know what it says. But when you quote it, you don't tell your audience that. You Dan Brown us. And it's not right, because Dan Brown's a novelist and you're portraying yourself as a historian. But there's a lacuna there.
Read my books, I include the lacuna.
Yeah, but I've heard you quote it without any kind of qualification.
I don't believe I have. If you read my books, I include the lacuna. But do you not believe that Jesus had a wife? He was a rabbi. He would have had a wife, yes?
Well, yes, he is married to the church.
No, the high priest of Jerusalem was supposed to have two wives. You know that. It says so in the Talmud. So was he married or was he not?
No, hey, can we put it back on the regular screen, or are you still sharing something? Because we're just looking at him while we're talking. I don't know if that's good for the audience. Let me
stop share. There we go.
No, I don't think so. But I mean, Maybe that's something we could discuss in a future time if we do that. But I feel like we've really discussed a lot of topics. I'm a little worried about the audience being overburdened, and this might be a good stopping place.
Might chop it up into one or two portions, so it won't be too burdensome.
Okay,
we've been across a lot of topics, but I hope you see that you're attached to the classical chronology and the classical story, but there is other information that you have been disregarding for a long time. And I hope you look at that alternate information and include it in your chronology.
I have a different hope for you, and it's that you would believe that Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament scriptures, and recognize that he did live a sinless life, was crucified for the sins of sinners, and rose again to conquer death. And he's coming back, not as the king of Edessa, but the king of kings. And I hope that's a new history and future you would adopt.
There's a point. Do you believe he was a real king in that case? You call him the King of Kings. Was he a king?
He's real king in an understanding of the fact that he, in his ultimate ontology,
so he
is pre-existent his birth. But upon this earth, he tells Pilate in John 18, my kingdom is not of this world. And it's not. He had no military power this side of heaven. He told disciples to put away their swords, to turn cheeks, not to start coups against Rome.
He also told them to buy swords, and he said that I'd come.
And then he said peace. 2 was enough. Come on, man, that ain't no rebellion.
Said, I don't come to bring peace on this earth. I come to bring a sword.
To divide households, because he knows that a mom will reject, and then the son will accept.
We have the beginnings of a revolt there, don't we?
No, he says, if my kingdom was of this world, my followers would rise up right now. But you know what's fascinating about the passage I'm quoting from? It's from John 18. And here's why it's fascinating. Because the earliest fragment of any New Testament gospel we have as of this date is a small of John 18, recto verso. And it's a conversation with Jesus and Pilate. And that's the very thing under discussion in the larger manuscript. And it's a beautiful thing because it ends up in Egypt, all the way 125, 150, within the 2nd century. Early physical attestation to Jesus speaking to a historical figure, Pilate, and the conversation is about how his power is not derived from an earthly source. So you have made up a Jesus that does not exist.
Respectfully, I would say that he does exist, because this is the problem with your story. Your Jesus doesn't exist. My Jesus does exist. He's a real character. He's a king of Edessa.
All hail the redhead ginger.
And on that note, gents, thank you. You've made my job today very, very easy, number one. Number two, this is such a broad and vast topic that I would like to do a part 2 at some point in the future, but thank you to you both. In closing, is there anything that you would like to say to each other in closing?
I don't know. Vocab, you got anything?
Well, I've talked to some Christ mythicist guys before, local and national. I've done dialogues recorded with Fitzgerald and Carrier. And that's not my main area these days. I deal with more urban cults like Hebrew Israelites and Kemetic guys and stuff like that. But, I still understand how important it is and enjoy doing and stuff like that. But, those guys seem tame compared to a lot of your theories. And I do understand, Mr. Ellis, that's why a lot of the Christ mythicists that would disagree with a lot of stuff I said here today might be rooting for me a little bit in this dialogue, because even other Christ mythicists realize Mr. Ellis's methodology is undisclosed, and when it is disclosed, it's poor. And that's not saying anything against you as a person or your vast amounts of information that you store in your head and you include in your books. Nothing against that, but the methodology is really it's such a foundational issue. It's like trying to, turn something into gold during the days of alchemy. You're never going to get the right result because your methods are all wrong. And I think that's a very serious issue. You really got to disclose what your methodology is and then stick with it. Until then, it's going to be difficult to look at what you're promoting as something that we should include in the historical conversation. And I don't mean that to disparage you or to hurt anyone's feelings. I understand you've written volumes, and writing books is hard. I have not written as much as you, and I respect that. But I'm just saying the methodology is a really fundamental problem. And if you could see that, I think you would get farther, because I know sometimes you feel kind of like maybe picked on, or these guys are trying to shut you out of the conversation. But I really believe it could be different if you would be willing to revisit some key methodological issues in how you do history.
Well, respectfully, I would have to disagree, because my methodology is sound.
Okay.
What you have is characters who are all missing from the historical record. And searching for those characters in the historical record is going to be difficult because the information is fragmentary. And we have secure evidence from Josephus that he's not telling you the full truth, and therefore you've got to divine the truth. And so my methodology, which is very sound, is to make sure that I have at least half a dozen, at the very least, links between two characters before I start to conflate them. And with the Josephus Saul, I have about 15 links between these two characters. That is sound methodology. And there's nothing else we can do. You can go down the Richard Carrier route and do it by mathematics, but I think that is nonsense as well. You cannot do yes, precisely. You cannot do history via mathematics, and I think you'll probably agree with that as well. You know, Bayesian mathematics takes no place in historical research. All we can do is get the similarities and put them together. And what I'm doing is creating a jigsaw puzzle. And it just so happens that all of the pieces in my jigsaw puzzle do fit together very nicely. And they also provide a picture. It's a slightly different picture to the one you're used to, because the Jesus character becomes a real king instead of a symbolic king, as I presume you see him as.
For now.
Yeah, well, yes. So you say he's going to become a king later. So you do agree with me. Yeah.
But more than the king of Edessa.
Well, yeah, I think he was pretty powerful, the king of Edessa, but there we go.
So powerful, anyway, no one knows but RALPH Ellis.
Well, yeah, it's a history that has been kept silent for at least 600 years. I think the Templars knew all about it. But yes, it has been lost from popular history, unfortunately. But now people know about Edessa. Everyone is now talking about Edessa, which is just great. So,
well, my Armenian Christian friends, they've been knowing, you know, I got, as I mentioned, Syrian and Assyrian and Egyptian. And I didn't mention Jordanian, but that's in Lebanese. My Armenian Christian friends, they know about it, you know. But I got you. But hey, guys, I really do got to take off, and I've enjoyed the dialogue. And let's link up later and see what can be done. Are we good? Am I?
Yeah.
I'm not leaving early or anything, right? We're good.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
All right, you guys have a beautiful day. I got to take off and get into some stuff. Have a great day. God bless. Peace.
How many roads? Too many signs, I can't read them. Wouldn't recognize the turn even if I